initiate our September meeting. Hey, I wanted to quickly kick off with a note that is in the e-news, and many of us had emails last week and the week before. We lost Carol, and this is a, she of course is a force of nature, right? And I think all of us, right, really appreciated knowing her, visiting with her. I remember when she had her garden was on the garden tour up in up there. And it was just she was a tremendous fun, all throughout. So she will be missed. Any reflections or any comments, any remembrances we want to share?
Oh,
Well, I remember her as the plant clinic instructor when we go up to the Elma, uh, when we go up to Elma and have a day's worth of instruction from Carol and Jude.
yeah. Carol was
It
in
was
this
fantastic to work with. Just great. All the time. Great.
and seeing her garden in, I think it was the garden tour in 2004, was one of the big reasons why I became a master gardener. I was so impressed with kind of the inventive things that she did in her garden and how beautiful it was, that it really inspired me and made me want to be a master gardener.
I always remember her energy. I mean, she was always
Mhm.
on, and just absolutely, positive, full of energy, and challenging us, right? Goes back to Bev's comments about plant clinics, right? To stay on top of things.
And she was a great cook. She always brought delicious things to our potlucks and our meetings when we used to have in-person meetings.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I joined Master Gardeners, it was 2010, and we were meeting at Causey every month. And Carol was like one of the first people that I remember because she was just this little tiny ball of fiery energy, just flitting around there, and she was so friendly and welcoming, and I just loved her.
Well, it truly was a loss, but we have so many great memories of her. And and so it was great that we had the write up in the e-news. And if indeed there's remembrances can be made actually to our foundation, if you are so inclined. Okay. So for today, lots of stuff going on. We have September to-dos to get around, a lot of program updates regarding foundations, regarding our elections. Dave Peter will be joining us here to talk about Washington prairies and specifically Western Washington prairies, which seems so bizarre when you start thinking about the hills and the forest, that we're all about. So I'm very much looking forward to his presentation. He's retired out of USDA. Okay, so a quick reflection back on August, right? We talked about the Grays Harbor County Fair last month. This month we get to talk about the Pacific County Fair, and there's Sue, manning the booth there, and Mike tallied all of the, all of the work and all of the activity. I was struck, Mike, by your tallying of the program priorities that were mentioned and brought up by folks that were there. For example, how noxious weeds and invasive species were so popular in terms of the discussion that we had. Any comments you want to share?
Yeah, I was struck, same as you. I was struck by that too. The looking at the important priorities and a big congratulations to everybody that kept a tight record on the paperwork for the program priorities and how many people had attended. And so it was real grateful of everybody to pay attention to detail and mark that down. But I thought it was interesting as just a side note. Well, what were people mostly interested in, and what were they not interested in? And the climate change and wildfire really surprised me as the least important priorities, but maybe something had to do with the invasive species display that we had, lots of information that Bev had accumulated, and the physical specimens we had for people to take a look at. And I was really struck by how many people were needed information on invasive species.
Yeah, I was really impressed with Jeff Nesbitt, who is the noxious weed guy in Pacific County. I called him up a week before the fair and I said, "Do you have a bunch of invasive information?" He said, "Sure." So I picked up a whole box of it just before we drove to Menlo to set up for the fair, and the stuff that I've never seen before. But they had these postcards size information on different types of invasive species, and people really gravitated to that.
Anyway, congratulations, on it. It's a smaller fair, but it's it's one of those fairs, right, that ensures that everybody coming to the fair has a chance to see us. And our location is actually quite prominent. We're actually this is one of the newest buildings, and our location is very visible and very approachable. So it's a good gig. So September also kicked off with the Rhonda show. So this is not Rhonda, this is not Rhonda of but of the television show. But I mean, you put on quite the program, Rhonda, there on the second. The dedication was a huge hit. So congratulations to everybody that joined. Congratulations on it just coming to pass, right?
Mhm.
Rhonda, any comments you want to share?
It was fun. It was the hornet sting lasted all week. It was painful. And I'm going to be out there. I'm leaving in about 20 minutes. I'll be out there to meet with JIT to finish up the little 3 things we're going to get done this week. And I think right now there's a little problem with a breaker, and Chris from Schumacher is already there addressing it this morning. I just appreciate everybody that came, and I don't know who submitted it to the Daily World, but thank you. Yeah, moving on now. Let's work with Peggy.
Okay. So by the way, it is if for folks who haven't had a chance, this is my first time actually seeing the greenhouse, and I'm very impressed by what all is there with the electricity, the lighting, the heat, the drainage. I mean that is a as a workspace, it is phenomenal. We could not ask for a better workspace.
And it was expensive, but considering all that got done, considering the delays, considering everything you have to do with a construction project, I'm really happy with it and really pleased with how flexible that whole group was in working with me. And Cindy just being so graceful at dealing with me was wonderful.
I just want to note for folks that just are, if you look in the picture here, that we had a yellow ribbon around the entire greenhouse, right? And so that alone was a feat of engineering. Anyway, congratulations. Congratulations on it being there. Okay.
Yeah.
Hey, so looking ahead to what we have here, so it's a busy month happening here. So we are here, on the 9th, right? Peggy, you have a meeting with your team on Thursday. Lori, you have a meeting with Greater Grace Harbor at Montesano Library.
Yep.
We're going to talk about the Dahlia Festival in the next slide here, but you've also got a workshop, Peggy, on houseplants coming up on Saturday.
We do, but our meeting on the 11th has been canceled. Instead, we are having a little salsa party that's not going to count as Master Gardener because there may be wine there. That'll be on the 14th instead. So we've canceled the one on the 11th. Our interns use the community garden to grow salsa plants, and so we're making salsa.
Wow. And clearly enjoying it, that's for sure.
Yes,
Well
yes, we
done.
plan
Well
on it.
done. I tell you, if you had to trade off Master Gardener hours for liquor, I think there's
Works for me.
that's okay. And then a quick reminder, the 20th is a picnic, right? So the potluck picnic on September 20th, right? So the Saturday after next, we are at Friends Landing, and that information is in the e-news. Okay. And Bev, you want to pick up the fact this is this weekend, Friday and Saturday is this Dahlia show, and it's kind of people down here, and how many people did we have last year visiting us?
Oh gosh, well over 100 in the 2 days. And this is a new event. Instead of what I said in the e-newsletter, it's the third annual Dahlia show instead of the second. And if you're a Dahlia grower and you want to participate, you can go online to their website, and you have two different uh, pages where you can register, and you still have time to register for the Dahlia Show. I believe judging is on Thursday. Um, the event of showing all off all everybody's dahlias is on Friday and Saturday. We will be there from 10 to 4 both days, and Mike will be there in his tool sharpening station from 1 to 4 that day. So even if you're not going to register for the Dahlia show, come on down because it's beautiful. And then once you've done the Dahlia show, you can go over to the Port of Oahu Saturday market and buy stuff from the vendors there. So hope to see you there.
She's actually consumed the entire toner volume of South Pacific County here by printing off, So if you don't know how to grow dahlias or take care of dahlias, we've got it covered here. Okay. Okay.
Lots of copies.
And they'll go. It is
Yeah,
interesting. I mean,
it's amazing. I when I did this last year, the first day I went stopped by to see how everything was going, and we were almost depleted. So I thought I got to make more than 20 copies of each, and there's 11 publications. So yeah, our toner cartridge system is pretty low.
okay. And of course, coming up the end of the month is the state conference. And so, as we've said all along, right, no excuses, no excuses for missing your continuing education hours this year, right? So, Aaron, any thoughts in terms of how are signups coming? What sort of, is anticipation growing for the big conference?
Yeah, it's the first thing on Friday morning is the state foundation meeting, and that's where the annual elections will be held. Everyone is welcome to attend that meeting, whether you're registered for the conference or not. And then right after that will be the keynote speaker. And it's going to be a lot of fun. We're actually having breakout groups, and some local groups are doing in person. So it's going to be a really great conference. However, they're still looking for a director for the AEC for 2026. No one has stepped up to take that role. Many of the people who are on the various committees are planning to continue, but they need someone to kind of take over the overall leadership of the process. And hopefully we can find somebody. If you're interested, let me know. I can get you in contact with the right people, because we don't want to miss out on having a 2026 conference.
Certainly don't. So heads up on that. So reach out to you, Aaron, right? If there's questions or interest in this. Very good. Okay, that end of this month. Okay, let's just jump into September to-dos from Oregon State, right? There's lots of talking here about if folks are gonna get into lawns, this is a good time to think about it ahead of the rains that should be coming, we hope are coming. There's a lot of talk here in terms of getting ready to think about frost, even though cold weather is really not on our horizon at this point. Recalling here also, don't composting any diseased plants, unless you've definitely got toasty temperatures going on in your compost pile. Okay. Planting, time to divide our peonies, our iris at fall planting, plant bulbs, calcium and phosphorus into the soil. Interesting that the little comment about the size of the bulb does give some indication about the size of the flower. And it's interesting. I'd really like to do more research in terms of understanding why that botanical truism, holds true, that the size of the flower would correlate to the size of the bulb. And of course, winter cover crops. This is the time to be thinking about putting those all in. And noting that, the WSU, despite how difficult it is, certainly for us here at the coast, right, given all the precipitation to grow cover crops, WSU Extension still encourages us very much to think about cover crops And you see that they have a flyer, right? You actually have a fact sheet on cover crops that are available. Okay. Pest monitoring, lots of pests coming out. I tell you, I'm getting carpenter ants. They're flying around, so this is the time everybody's swarming. Not just, and that slugs are a tremendous issue for us at this point. And that they're talking here about this spotted wing, Drosophila that's still out there to be watched out and to be very much cared for. So lots of things to be thoughtful about that. No, I wanted to go into other announcements. Where did I go over this thing? Yeah. So talking about so let's just pick up a couple comments here regarding okay. So, a couple slides were out of order here. So other lookouts here for other invasives. So Washington Invasives has added just last month a number of 19 new plant species to their prohibited list. And ivy, of course, you would think ivy should have been on the list long ago, right? But it was just officially added just last month. But you'll see under the website that's at the lower right of the screen there, a place to go to see the full list of plants that are on it. And again, like to the point is that you've got to think that why wasn't Herb Robert, right? Stinky geranium on the list long ago. But it looks like they've got a strong update here of plants that we definitely do not want in the state. And so as we can appreciate, so many of these are already with us. And the cinquefoil, for example, the common fennel. But we're just going to have to, at least these are things to be thinking about when we talk about to the public regarding this list being available and being known. And so on the website, you have good identification tips and good pictures to this. Okay. So program updates. And I wanted to begin, Mike, I'll turn this over to you talking about October elections. Per our bylaws, right? Our foundation officers are elected in October for the following year. So in October, at the end of October, we'll push a ballot out, an email ballot out to all of our foundation members, asking them to vote for officers for 2026. And all positions are up for election. Mike, you've reached out to current officers, right, asking about their interest in continuing, but all positions are open. You want to share and continue on?
Yep, I agree that the October meeting is very important, like everybody to attend, and that here's the time for election of the 2026 board. As Kelly had said, I sent out a message to everybody, hey, what's your interest? Are you still willing to participate in your current position for 2026? And I've gotten a couple replies back, and especially want to concentrate the most on president-elect. And I'm willing to serve for 2026 and help mentor a person for 2027. And we've got such a fantastic board and great support network that everybody complements one another and really makes it a lot of fun to be able to be on the board. And you can go to our website and see what the job position descriptions are and how that works at that volunteer portal there. And just encourage everybody to participate. It's a wonderful opportunity to learn about the internal workings of our organization. I've learned so much, and just you get a deeper respect for what it is we do in the positions that we hold.
Questions or comments from anyone here regarding these positions? Again, obviously it is very important, right? As we talk about this, of course, we remind ourselves that we are master gardeners, and we come together today in a program meeting to get continuing education and to share our activities and so forth. But behind it is the foundation. And the foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit recognized by the IRS. And our whole purpose, right, is to raise money and support the program. And as we all know, we are one of very few counties that entirely support our program through the funds that we raise. So the foundation activities that we engage in are incredibly important relative to supporting the Master Gardener program here in our two counties. And so this speaks again to the opportunity here, reminding that as a service organization, it is our responsibility, not just a good idea or a nice thing to do, but our responsibility to step up and to volunteer. So to that point, this is the opportunity we have here for elections. Okay, another reminder here, by the way, is that tonight, Doug Tallamy, who teaches at the University of Delaware, is giving a live work session on how we want to manage our fall gardens. And the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, right? I mean, these guys that's the gold standard for birding, right? They are sponsoring this tonight or they're actually this afternoon at 4 o'clock our time. So Tallamy is a great speaker and very compelling. And what I expect to hear this afternoon is how we would like to leave an untidy yard in the fall, an untidy yard that would support overwintering of insects and overwintering of wildlife. So you'll see the URL is up there, allaboutbirds.org, Fall Garden Doug Tallamy. So I encourage it. It's free, and so don't miss this opportunity because he is a great speaker. And Eva has reminded us that fall time is a time at which we're often out, pruning, preparing, mucking around in our yards and in our landscapes. And as Eva shared in a text last night, this is oftentimes when you may find wildlife that is in distress and may need support. And so the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife has on this web page here an entire list of where to go, who to reach out to should you find a wild animal in care of need. Very much as you'll see here on the web page, don't try to mess with this yourself, right? If you have a wild animal, get a professional involved. Eva, do you want to share a little bit about your involvement with the group down here and any thoughts, recommendations for all of us here?
Sure. We tend to, I always tend to want to do my pruning and yard cleanup in the fall rather than the spring, precisely because of young critters. But, we do still have quite a few in the fall at our rehab center here on the peninsula. Just yesterday, I picked up a bunch of baby squirrels. We have baby birds there at present and baby bunnies. So just take extra care and checking out your bushes and trees if you can before you're doing your pruning and cleanup. And always reach out to a rehabilitator if you can. We have a lot of them in the state here, and most of them will provide some transport. So if you can't get the critter to where you want, oftentimes these facilities will provide somebody to come and pick it up for you. So thank you, Kelly, for bringing this up. I appreciate it.
Other thoughts, other comments from folks that relative to wildlife that you may have seen. By the way, Eva, I'll just even volunteer. I mean, imagine you're willing to be reached and contacted if anyone has a question regarding anything.
Absolutely, you bet.
Eva does a lot of volunteering at the local Peninsula Rehabilitation Center, and other comments, questions regarding wildlife. Okay, very good. Okay, so I want to come back and just do our introduction. I see that David has joined us here, and I'm very excited, David, in welcoming you to our merry band here, and thanking you for joining us, because this is a subject that we don't often think about here in Western Washington, right? The concept of prairies throughout the state, and the ecology of prairies as it affects not only obviously what we're trying to restore or trying to deal with today, but historically how they all came to be. And of course, it's a great picture you have here, right? Relative to this, relative to the prairie and the mountain in the background here. So, if I may, I will turn this over to you, and I'll stop a share and let you do your own introduction and go from there.
Okay, so can you hear me okay?
We certainly can.
Okay, so let me get my screen shared here. Hang on here. So right there. And put this up, and let me see if I can get a laser pointer going here. Okay, can you all see that screen okay? You can see my laser pointer and
We
whatnot here?
can. Well done.
Okay. So yeah, so I'm talking about prairies of the Olympic Peninsula today. And I want to point out that I have a co-author on this project, Stan Graham, and we have been working on this project for actually quite a few years. Now, the fruition of this project will finally come probably a couple years yet, and we will, at that point, publish a general technical report from a U.S. Forest Service report from the Pacific Northwest Research Station. But I think we're probably a couple years out from being able to do that yet. So you're going to get kind of a preview of what some of the content of that is going to be. So with that, first of all, why do we even care about prairies? Okay, so well, they're being lost to neglect, just benign neglect. Prairies are an important part of native culture and Northwest history. And they're biologically diverse, I might add, more so than the surrounding forests. Many species are dependent either entirely or in part on the prairies for their habitat. They're really pretty poorly understood by the public, but they require management, as you're going to see as we go along. And my favorite is they're just plain beautiful. Okay, so those would be some reasons why we might care about them. But where do they come from? Where did they originate? And the data mostly comes from the study of fossil pollen. And we really have to go back to the last glacial advance to tell our story here. If we go back 15 to 19,000 years, we would find that the main vegetation in the Puget Lowlands and around on the peninsula is tundra and taiga. So the north and east sides of the peninsula at that time were completely covered in ice. The climate was cold and dry. So Arctic tundra was present near the ice, but as you get farther away from the ice, whether you go south towards the Columbia or out on the south and west sides of the Olympic Peninsula, the vegetation is what we call taiga, which is kind of an open boreal woodland. All right, so that's what was present there. And interestingly, as I'm going to point out in a few minutes here, probably some of our prairie species were present in that tundra and taiga, even though we didn't have prairies. Well, then, about 15,000 years ago, the climate began to warm very rapidly, and in came a number of species. I've listed some of the trees that were coming in there. Initially, we had kind of a moist subalpine-like forest of mountain hemlock was present, but then it dried a bit and the hemlock was replaced by subalpine fir. Then it warmed even more, and in came Douglas fir, red alder, bracken fern. The bracken fern, the fact that it is so prominent tells us that we're probably dealing with a woodland right now. So we could say that we had warming, then cooling, then warming again. We probably don't have anything that we would recognize as a prairie just yet until we get to the very end of this period of time. And then it warms quite a lot more. In comes Oregon white oak. along with a number of other prairie grasses and species. And so now we have something that we would definitely call a prairie. In fact, it's very much warmer at this time than it is right now. And as you can see over on the far side over here, we have a lot of fire activity. Now, we don't know if that fire activity was anthropogenic, in other words, human caused or not. But we do know we have a lot of fire activity. We also know it's warmer and drier. Possibly anthropogenic burning wasn't needed to maintain the prairies then. My personal opinion probably was, but we simply don't have the evidence to show one way or the other at that point. But the one thing we do know is that in the next step, the climate cooled and became much moister. In came red cedar, western hemlock, a lot of our ferns and things like that we have now. And from that point on, from probably 5,000, 5,500 years ago up to the present, you would have had to have had anthropogenic burning, or we simply wouldn't even be talking about it today. They would have gone away 5,000 years ago, and we would have nothing to talk about other than just a little footnote that, yeah, they probably existed at one time. So we are yet to get the solid evidence in the pollen record for this kind of thing. There are people working on this, by the way, but in terms of a logical argument, they simply couldn't have existed for all that 5,000 years, possibly even for the 9,000 years without people burning the landscape to maintain them. So our prairie flora came together from probably two sources. First of all, we know that we have a group of prairie species, very characteristic prairie species, that we find, down here in the lowlands on the prairies, but also again up in the alpine of the Olympic Peninsula and other places. And so we know that this group of species, and it's larger, this is just a sampling here than what I put down here, that this group of species probably could have tolerated that tundra and taiga environment back then and was probably present at that time. Not so for an even larger group of species. And again, this is just a sampling of them. These species could not have tolerated that climate at all, probably hung out down in Southern Oregon and Northern California until the climate changed and had to make the long trek north. So our prairie flora came together when these guys finally arrived on the scene and combined. That's between 5,000 and 9,000 years ago. And so that's kind of how our flora has come together. But what's happened to our prairies? A lot of them have gone away, right? Well, the demise of the prairies, you can think of as collateral damage of an epidemiological catastrophe, possibly beginning as early as Cortez. He unleashed smallpox on the Aztecs back in the 1500s. And there is some evidence that that epidemic went continent-wide. But for sure, we had a big increase in the epidemics when the sea traders showed up along the coast in the late 1700s. But it really was the combination of those epidemics with an invasion of Euro-Americans in the 1800s that was really consequential ecologically. Okay, so consider Western Oregon, fever and ague, that's an old term for malaria. After 1818, depopulation, or 1830, depopulation and white majority by 1845. Western Washington, measles, 1845, smallpox, 1853, depopulation and white majority by 1858, and then just a little later up in British Columbia, 1862, depopulation and white majority by 1880. So it was the combination of the diseases and the influx of Euro-Americans that has made the difference. The result, entire villages wiped out, leaders died, the workforce was decimated, starvation was common. Prairie maintenance was just probably not a high priority at that time, but regardless, the settlers didn't want the prairies burned. They're busy building houses and fences and growing crops on them. So, so they put an end to it. The ecological effects were evident to the trained eye quite early on. 1853 is when J.G. Cooper, he actually published in 1859, but he was out there doing his survey work for the Pacific Railroad Survey in 1853. And here's what he had to say. Says, on some prairies near Vancouver, Washington, and Squally, where this burning has been prevented for 20 years past, young spruces, that's his term for Douglas fir, are found to be growing up rapidly, and the Indians have told me that they can remember when some other prairies were much larger than at present. So to a botanist, it was obvious what was going on that early from the cessation of burning. But it wasn't so obvious to the settlers, and by 1850, they were streaming in by the thousands, occupying land and bringing more disease. They didn't understand that the prairies weren't natural places. They just assumed they were always going to be there. They didn't understand that the importance of the prairies, or what the importance of the prairies was to the Indians, and they didn't understand that many prairies, not all, but many prairies were poor prospects for agriculture. But of course, they figured that out soon enough. The prairies, regardless, the prairies were places that could be occupied without clearing the forest. And they could graze their animals on them, and they could scratch out a garden for a few years while they set to work clearing forests from better soils or finding other employment. So some prairies became farms and ranches, towns grew on some, forests grew on the rest. Today, the remaining prairies that we have are on the worst glacial outwash soils that were not suitable for farms and where trees grew the slowest. So yes, there's a lot of prairies out there we don't really understand because they don't fit in this category. And even of these, relatively few have been restored. So most of our prairies are anthropogenic. That just means human cause. They exist in landscapes that naturally grow forests, which is why humans have to be involved. You have to keep the forest out or you don't have prairies. And they have indistinct margins. And this is really important. They blended with the surrounding forest through savannas and open woodlands. And as I'm going to point out to you as we go along, these savannas and open woodlands were oftentimes far more extensive than the prairies themselves. So how do you get a prairie on a landscape like that? So I'm putting up a model here. I'm going to use the Douglas fir Western Hemlock pathway here because most of our prairies grow in vegetation like that. And I want you to focus first of all on the outer loop because that is the natural successional loop on almost all of our land. Okay, so we know that after a forest fire, the forest is going to grow back. It's just going to take time, right? And so in the beginning, you get some herbs and grasses, maybe a few shrubs, some tree seedlings. And on this pathway, those seedlings are going to be mostly Douglas fir, and they're going to start to dominate. And eventually, they're going to close canopy. And of course, that's when the understory becomes a forest understory instead of these early cereal plants down here. And if you go on for 500 to 1,000 years without disturbance, well, the Douglas fir can't reproduce in the shade and hemlock can, so one by one they get replaced by hemlocks. No matter, either way, fire comes through again sooner or later, and you come back over and start over. So our land will naturally cycle here as long as we give it, maybe 50 years, maybe 40 years on some better sites. We'll grow a forest, and around it'll go. And that's all we get. So how in a landscape like that do you get a prairie? Well, you get a prairie by burning a lot more often. Okay, so average of 3 years, maybe 1 to 5 years, something like that. What is happening is you're burning so often that every time a shrub or a tree seed germinates and starts to grow, a fire comes through and kills it because they're very vulnerable at that time. If you give them enough time, the shrubs will usually develop big root systems and rhizome systems, and they'll sprout back after a fire. But if you burn often enough, they never get to that point. And with trees, there's only a couple trees, mainly Douglas fir and Oregon white oak or Gary oak, depending on your preference. Those two tree species will actually get a thick enough bark with time that a prairie fire won't bother them. And so the problem, though, is getting old enough to have that bark. Okay, you can't do that on a cycle that's this short. So around and around it goes as long as you keep up that rapid burning cycle. Now, if we back that off a little bit, maybe 8 to 15 years, 10-ish years, something like that. Well, now occasionally, almost randomly, an oak tree or a fir tree might escape one burn, then it'll have an extra interval to get big enough and thick enough bark on it that it'll survive the next fire. And so you get a scattering of oaks or Douglas firs. And yes, around and around and around, you can go with that as long as you keep up that cycle. Back it off a little bit more, what happens? Well, you get a lot more trees through the same process. But you also start recruiting a lot more shrubs, which means you're recruiting a lot more fuels. Now, this is starting to get pretty unstable when it comes to fire. Can it be cycled? Yes, with careful prescribed burning. But you've got a volatile situation that's likely to result in a catastrophic fire and kill all the trees. Now, if at any point you stop the burning cycles that we've indicated over here, doesn't matter, they're all going to slide right out into this successional pathway of forest. And if it gets up to a mature Douglas fir forest, the next time it burns, it's coming back over here, folks. All of this is going to go away. And then it's just going to be cycling around and around and around there. So how do you get this much fire on the landscape? Well, I'll tell you flat out, there is no natural way it can happen. Not in our climate. Okay, possibly between 5,000 and 9,000 years ago, but not in this climate. People are the only way it happens. And those people were Native American people for at least 5,000, maybe as much as 9,000 years. And if we're going to go forward with this, if we're going to keep these on the landscape, then we have to pick up the ball and do that, or they're going to go away. So why was it so important to Native peoples? Well, contrary to popular belief, Native peoples didn't survive on clams and salmon. That was important, but so were root crops, camas, bracken fern rhizomes. There were a number of other bulbs as well. Acorns, very nutritious when processed to remove the tannins, but oftentimes lost in the descriptions here is hunting. These prairie areas were extremely important big game winter range and attracted these animals down to where they could be hunted. Okay, so it was very important for that. As I'm going to show you in some of the woodlands and savannas, bear grass was important. It's a basketry item. It was an extremely valuable trade item. Also, around the edges of the prairies and savannas, there's a variety of berries that grow that don't grow out on the prairies and won't produce back in the forest. And so that's where you get them. And there's a lot of medicinal plants that grow on the prairies. So these things were multi-purpose, extremely important to Native peoples. And they made sure that even though the climate had changed in favor of forest, they were still going to have these resources. So we're going to talk about several different kinds of prairies today. But first of all, when you look back in the historical literature, you'll find that the surveyors and the settlers were using different terms for the prairies. They used the term meadow, barrens, burns, openings, all for prairies. And they also referred to a lot of wetlands as prairies. Now, today, we're going to talk about the three that are in yellow here, what I call the oak camas romer's fescue, and I'll just abbreviate that to oak camas type of prairie. This is the kind that you find in the Puget Willamette Trough. It is a grassland with camas in it, and it typically has oaks either scattered on it or fringing around the edge of it. Now, the Western Olympic version of prairie is the bracken camas type, and it's dominated by bracken ferns, but often has camas, not always, but often has camas as well. And then I'm going to talk about the beargrass savannas and woodlands, and this is kind of a new category, so you heard it first here. It'll be in our report, but This is found in the southeast Olympic Peninsula and the Quinault Reservation. It's typified as a Douglas fir woodland or savanna with a bare grass understory. And it might also include things like bracken, dwarf bilberry, tall Oregon grape, Columbia manzanita, creeping snowberry. And we're going to come back and talk about some of those in a little while. Now, what we're not going to talk about, both the surveyors and the settlers referred to a number of different wetlands, fens, bogs, salt marshes as prairies. Those will be talked about in our paper, but we're not going to talk about them today. And also coastal bluffs and dunes were referred to as prairies. Again, we'll mention those in the report, but we won't deal with those today. So here is a map of the Olympic Peninsula showing the three kinds of prairie systems we're going to talk about. The bare grass woodlands down here in the southeast Olympic Peninsula. Also, there seems to be some on the Quinault Reservation. I haven't been able to map them because I haven't been able to get access to do so. But the oak camas, that's this purple area here. Notice that we have a black line going through here. That's following the Chehalis and the Black Rivers. This is how we've defined our study area. So we're talking about the area north of that today. But the oak camas prairies on this side of the line are similar to those on the other side. And finally, the bracken camas prairies, we have a group here. We have some up in here as well. Now, to talk about these, we're going to use some examples. So for the oak camas type, we'll use the Mima prairie. We're going to talk about the bracken camas type with two examples, the Carlisle prairies and the Quileute prairie up here. And then finally, at the end, we're going to come back and talk about the bare grass savannas and woodlands down here in the southeastern Olympic Peninsula. So, Mima prairie, the oak camas type, surveyed in 1858. Now, there are some other large prairies here. There's one here. There's one down here. There's some smaller ones here and here. Those are across the river, so we're not talking about them. But yeah, Mima prairie here, a little bit of Gate prairie down here. There were already in 1858, when the General Land Office surveyed it, 4 settlers out there. Now, in terms of soils, most of the Mima prairie is actually the Spanaway gravelly sandy loam, okay? And agriculturally, that's a pretty awful soil. It's really gravelly, sandy as the name says, not very fertile, horrible water holding capacity. But note that this prairie is not monolithic. There's some much better soils down in this corner down here. And I'd submit to you that that's probably where most of the camas digging was done. Camas would have grown much larger, would have reproduced better, grown back faster after harvest. And you wouldn't be breaking your digging sticks trying to dig in this rock up here. This is much better. So you have down there the Nisqually loamy sand. Warehousers now made good use of that with a tree nursery. There's also some fairly productive farms down there as well. So let's look at the ownership. And most of it's private. We do have the Mima Mounds Natural Area Preserve up here. And we do have the Thurston County Park Glacial Heritage Preserve down here. You'll notice that most of the intervening Spanaway soil has been taken over by housing development. That's because it's about the only thing it's worth economically. That soil perks really well, and so that's where you put all the houses. The land ownership down here where the soils are good, much larger blocks, that's because it's actually valuable for something as long as you keep it in larger blocks. Look at that, what it looks like today. And you can see the prairies in here and the farms and so forth down in here and the houses in between. This is a picture out at the Glacial Heritage Preserve. These two prairies, Mima Mounds and Glacial Heritage Preserve, are some of the best restored prairies we have. If you want to go see a prairie in the springtime, these are probably your best choice. Okay, so now the bracken camas types. Um, and here we have the Carlisle prairies, and they were surveyed in 1858. Nobody was living on them at the time. The soils out there, um, if only the climate would cooperate. These are fantastic agricultural soils. We have Kalawa silt loam. We have the Wishkah silty clay loam. There are a lot of wetlands included. Most of the land actually is upland, but there's a lot of wetlands. And we have three soils here that are typically wetlands. Now, the Nema silty clay loam, this is the community that grows on it that I'm showing you right here. It's not quite as wet as these other two, and camas grows in it. That's these little blue flowers in here. And this tells us that camas was part of the flora out there, even though now there's hardly anything to show for the prairies. It's all grown up in the forest. But out here in these wetlands, you can still find a little bit of camas, along with things like cranberry and sphagnum moss, not the combination you usually associate with prairies, but it does happen out there. Now, the ownership is mostly private again. There's some public lands. This one's DNR. The rest of these are county lands out here. Very difficult to access, though, because all of them are surrounded by private lands, which are mostly timber companies. And of course, they have their roads gated off. So you kind of have to get permission to go through their lands to get at these private lands. What's there now? Well, as you can see, a lot of forest is there now. This picture right here comes from the very center of that prairie right there. That's some county land right there. There's virtually nothing left of these prairies other than out here in these little wetlands, the Nema soil series, where you can get a little bit of camas, and along the edge, you can get some shore pine, aka lodgepole pine, which is also, by the way, a prairie-associated species, as we'll see in a little while. So another example would be the Quileute prairie of the bracken camas type. It was surveyed first in 1881, and there were already 4 homesteaders on it at the time. The soils here are much more uniform, mostly the Quileute silt loam. And again, a wonderful soil agriculturally, except that the climate doesn't really cooperate with that. So mostly what happens out there is livestock grazing. Now, Little Prairie, this is called Little Prairie. The soil is a little more gravelly up there, the Wellman gravelly silt loam. But ownership out there, again, mostly private. There is a chunk of public land here that belongs to the city of Forks. Now, the history of this end of the prairie is that it was, for many, many years, a naval air station. And you can see the runways out there. When the Navy quit using it, they sold off all of their, this was all like base housing and stuff. They sold off that for private, to private people, but they gave one chunk right here to the city of Forks. And if you go out there and look in the vegetation around those runways now, you can put together a pretty good species list of prairie plants. So there actually is a little bit of restoration potential out there. But what you see of the prairie as a whole is a lot of tree invasion all around the edge. It's been breached right through the center in a couple places. This is kind of sad because this is a very recent growth of forest in here. But the remaining pastures that are out here, and that's what this is being used for, is pasture land, you can still find some camas, occasional lupins, maybe a native buttercup or two. So yeah, the Quileute and Little Prairie, if land could be made available, would have some restoration potential. Now, Albert B. Reagan was the first to map this area. So here's Quileute and Little Prairie. Here's Forks Prairie, which of course has the city of Forks down at this end of it here. But he also mapped a series of little prairies along the Solduck River. And here's what he has to say about those. He says, they have a black soil of vegetable mold and are extremely fertile. It is noticeable that the prairies follow the river and are about a day's journey from each other for a canoeman. Also, The Indians fished and hunted throughout this region formerly, and their only highway was the river. It's possible that these prairies were the camping places of the Aborigines, and again, to strengthen this theory, the Indians dug fern roots from these prairie regions, that's bracken fern roots, dried them and made them into a kind of paste bread, which they made into a paste bread. These roots they gathered in the fall and in the spring, and at each gathering in the fall, they burned the prairie over so they could find the roots easier, and also so that they could see the elk. And this is important. We're going to come back to the subject of elk in a while. That would attempt to cross the open area, for the ferns grew higher than a horse's back. So very vigorous growth of ferns. And by the way, there were camas plants growing out there as well. Okay, let's talk about the beargrass woodlands now. And first of all, we kind of need to talk about beargrass itself, because beargrass, when it's not in flower, looks very much like a bunch grass. It's just a tussock of grass-like leaves. Of course, when it flowers, you can really see the difference. Now, what I'm going to show you here is an area. This entire area was once part of the beargrass woodlands. And the Olympic National Forest has undertaken I guess you could call it kind of an experimental restoration. So we're going to call this area the Restoration Unit. And that began in the year 2003, when the overstory was mostly removed, and then they prescribed burned it. It was burned again in 2015. And as I understand it, they're planning another burn for next year. So this area, of course, was once under forest similar to this area down here. So this is also on the Olympic National Forest. This is checkerboard ownership, by the way. You can see some large canopies down there amongst there. That's these big Douglas fir trees. And those would have been the original savanna woodland dominant trees. And all the other trees have come in since then. So we studied the beargrass and we published a couple papers on it. And basically, long story short, in the restoration unit, the beargrass grows much bigger, much healthier, flowers much more often, and is successful in germinating its seeds. So we have an expanding population out here. Down here, actually, each of these orange flags is marking a pathetic little beargrass plant struggling underneath the salal there. Down here, the beargrass is languishing, slowly dying out, even though it's probably been dying out for 50 or 60 years now, and is not reproducing at all. In 2 years, we could find no seedlings whatsoever. So it's a dying population, slowly dying population here, and a rapidly expanding population here in a place that used to look a lot like this. Okay, so beargrass needs open ground if it's going to survive for long. Well, turns out it used to be kind of open down there. This is 1929, and remember, Indian burning stopped in the 1850s. You can see the ground down here quite a bit. You can also see a lot of small crown trees that have come in since 1850. So this was much more open. And how do we know they came in since then? Well, we did a study about that, and we increment cored a lot of trees in both of the areas. And what we found was that in the 1700s and early 1800s, tree establishment occurred almost randomly, kind of one at a time, kind of as if you were burning that area maybe every 10 years or so. But once the trees were signed, the Indians were dispossessed of their land, boom, in comes the tree regeneration, mostly shore pine and Douglas fir, a little bit of hemlock as well. And they just increased to the point where around 1950 or 55, the canopies closed and the understory became so dark that tree regeneration couldn't happen anymore. And that's probably the last time beargrass reproduced as well. And that's the case right up until now in the woodland unit. But in the restoration unit in 2003, we opened it up. Of course, the beargrass did famously, but so do the tree regeneration. Now we're getting a lot of tree regeneration, which tells you that Yes, we have to open it up for the bear grass, but we're going to have to keep coming back and burning to take care of this issue. Otherwise, it goes right back into this phase right here. Okay, so that area is right up in here. Okay, let's look at a much bigger area out here. It looks from the air like a typical managed forest landscape, but it's not. First of all, there's a whole bunch of prairies that the General Land Office mapped down here along the south end of that area. And then in the center, there is some vegetation that it seems like the GLO surveyors just didn't know what to do with. One of the surveyors, as he surveyed along his section lines, he would say, enter prairie, and then leave prairie. And then he comes back on another line. He says, enter, leave, another line, enter, leave. This is how they did all of these prairies here. They would then connect the dots. But he never put it on the map. And so that intrigued me. I said, well, why didn't he put it on the map? He noted all these places. It was definitely different from the surrounding area. Well, I put it on the map. I took his marks and I connected the dots. And then we said, oh, we got to go out there and sample this thing. We got to see what's there because he called it a prairie. Well, we went out there and all these are plots that we put in. And every one of those plots is a bear grass plot. And we said, oh, well, it's pretty different than what they were calling prairies. It had more trees. It had a different understory. And as we looked, it was incredibly extensive. Other surveyors found the same kind of vegetation, but they didn't call it a prairie. And in the end, what we had was a large area that had a lot of bear grass, which we knew from other studies required open ground. And we now have one surveyor that talked about it as if it was a prairie. And so we also noticed it aligns with the prevailing winds. So if you were to start a fire anywhere out here, that's the way it's going, folks. It's going to be an elongated thing like that. So we said, well, what kind of historical information can we find that would support this idea? Because ecologically, it looks like it's a thing. And we did find some. The first one was P.H. Roundtree. He says that in the spring of 1861, from the head of the Skookum, which is Shelton Bay over here, we traveled west through open timber in almost level country to the Satsep over here. So open timber, and look where it goes. This black line, by the way, is a trail that was mapped by the General Land Office. So that's most likely the route that he was taking. Deer and bear were in sight often, so we had quite a sight distance, as high as 7 or 8 deer at a time could be seen. Okay, so that was the first one. And then we found another interesting one. And this one is actually specific for this area here, published in the Mason County Journal in 1887. They're talking about an open burn about 3½ miles in width and 18 miles in length, which is almost a dead level and has a surface nearly smooth as a frozen lake. It's covered in a beautiful green coat of bunch grass. Well, this guy's not a botanist, so I'm going to submit to you that that's bear grass, and a few fir trees with large bushy tops. Now, Douglas fir trees only get large bushy tops when they're open grown, and then they do it with abandon, and is one of the finest natural stock ranges I've seen west of the Cascade Mountains. A team hitched to a wagon or buggy can be driven all over this burn, the same as you would drive over a level prairie. So that's a pretty good description of this area. Now I want to talk about this area up here. I call this the North Fork Plateau because the North Fork Skokomish River comes down here, and this is all a plateau between that and Hood Canal. It's a flat area up there. And I'm also going to bring in the words of George Neville Jones. This is almost 50 years after the last description. He was a botanist. He was a student at the University of Washington working on his PhD. And here's what he says of this area in general. He says, on the dry, gravelly soils in parts of Mason County where the Douglas fir has already completed the first or invading stage of the sear. So he's saying the Douglas fir is invading. It wasn't there, and now it's coming in. and is well on its way to the second or competitive stage. That's when it closes canopy, but it's only well on its way. It's not there yet. There are open park-like forests of fir and lodgepole pine, the latter soon outstripped. Okay, so we're talking about fir and lodgepole pine, just like we were talking about over on the Olympic National Forest. And the lodgepole pine is soon outstripped and gradually replaced by the former, the Douglas fir, in which the trees are distant and well spaced. In this association, there is a remarkable assemblage of subdominant ericaceous shrubs, and he mentions a bunch of them. We're going to come back and talk a little more about dwarf bilberry and about the Columbia manzanita in a while. But the most surprising of all, he says, is the pine lily, another term for beargrass, occurring scattered among the lodgepole pine and fir trees. So let me get all that verbiage off so you can kind of see what's behind that. And you can see that just as he describes it, there's a lot of, these would be fir and lodgepole pine trees invading. So this was much more open in the 1800s and before. Along the creeks and streams, this is the North Fork of the Skokomish here, but along the tributaries, you get a thicker growth of trees. These are down in canyons, and this is all flat plateau top up here. What's there now? Well, it's been transitioned into an industrial forest, and sometimes in some of these areas, we're actually starting to push up our third crop of trees. Well, we went out there and we did a lot of plots, and every one of our plots that I'm showing you here has beargrass in it. Languishing very much like on the Olympic National Forest, but it's down there underneath the salal and the fir trees, trying to struggle. It gets a little boost when you clear cut it, provided, of course, they don't use herbicides. It gets a little boost then. So how long this can go on, I don't know. One more testimonial here, little different area up here now. And this one was in the Shelton Sentinel, July 11th, 1892. And the author says, the drive between Shelton and the river is the Skokomish, and that line right there, that is what the General Land Office mapped as the route through there. The drive between Shelton and the river is a delightful one, leading as it does over beautiful grass-covered prairies and lovely forest stretches, which are free from the usual underbrush and fallen timber so common in the woods of Western Washington. So now this guy actually does go over some grass-covered prairies, but then he comes out into this woodland country, which is probably what he's referring to with the lovely forest stretches. But he notes that you don't have underbrush and you don't have fallen timber. Why not? Well, because there is fire moving through this landscape. It's burning underneath the trees, and it's clearing out any underbrush and any wood that happens to fall during the previous year. So, so even the forest stretches were far different than anything we're used to seeing nowadays. So I want to point out to you that the area that I've identified here as beargrass woodland savanna, we're talking 107,510 acres, and that's just the southeastern Olympic Peninsula portion of it. And by the way, savannas and woodlands also existed in between a lot of the South Puget Sound prairies with a different flora. Okay, the sum total of all the acreage in all the prairies is only 4,600 acres that I'm showing you right here. So arguably, in terms of ecology, the savannas and woodlands are the far more important form of vegetation on the landscape. Now, the soils all come from the same parent material. It doesn't matter if you're in one of these prairies or in the beargrass savanna woodland system. They're all Vashon, glacial till, drift, outwash, poor water holding capacity, low fertility, pretty nasty soils and all. But there is a difference. All of the prairies that I'm showing you here have the Carstairs soil series. And what sets it apart are the darkened A horizons. So that superficial soil layer is very dark on Carstairs, and you don't get that out here in this woodland savanna system. Okay, now what gives you the dark color on the prairies is those thousands of years of burning, grass and herbs. They form a very fine powdery-like charcoal that is then incorporated into the soil by burrowing organisms and possibly by camas digging as well. And that gives you your dark soil horizon. So it's so reliable that whenever we find it, we go, oh, there was a prairie here. But you don't get that out here. Okay. Why not? Well, why wouldn't you? Well, here's the story. We're burning much less often out here. Okay. There's one thing. Two, because of that, we're getting higher fuel loadings when we burn. So when we burn, it's much hotter. Okay. So more of the carbon is going to end up as ash and carbon dioxide and less as fine charcoal. And on top of that, we're getting the kind of charcoal that you are going to get out there is going to be more likely from, say, shrubs or small trees that burn up there. And so it's going to be coarse and chunky, not finely divided. So those would be some reasons why this soil would appear in the superficial layers differently from these soils down here. So let's talk about some of the plants that grow out there. This group of plants are all very typical of the South Puget Sound prairies, of the camas, of the oak camas fescue prairie system. That's the fescue right there. And true enough, around the Shelton prairies, we find a lot of that stuff. And then we also find it on the other prairies out here. We don't find this group of species hardly at all inside of the beargrass savanna woodland. There's this interesting little thing here where we find oak and longstone sedge right along with the beargrass. I don't know any other place you can really find that situation, so that maybe is a whole different thing going on there. But there are a number of typical prairie species that we find out there, and that would include these, the hookspur violet, the fawn lily, the sickle-keel lupin. As you can see, they kind of cross the boundaries, and we find a lot of them in both places still. A very interesting one is this rosy bird's foot trefoil. This is a plant that I had, until this study, never considered associated with anthropogenic fires or areas. And yet it seems to have a very tight association with the burning out here. Where you find it outside, it's mostly around some of the other prairies. When you get out into areas that have absolutely no history of anthropogenic burning, you almost don't find it at all. So I'm guessing this is something that is surviving in the soil seed bank and pops up every time they do a clear cut out there, which is why we find so much of it out there, but is dependent on, or had been dependent on, anthropogenic burning. So let's talk about a few shrubs that we find out there. Trailing snowberry and dwarf bilberry are interesting in that you find them pretty much over in the western end of this anthropogenic system. All right, you don't find them so much in the east end. Whereas the Columbia manzanita, you find pretty much over in the eastern part of the system and not so much over in the western part. And the tall Oregon grape, guess what? Right in the middle. Well, when an ecologist sees something like this, you immediately start to think, oh, I'll bet there's some kind of environmental gradient going on out there. And so I went looking for that. And it turns out there's actually a pretty good precipitation gradient going on there. Not much in terms of temperature. In fact, the temperatures are almost the same. So what appears to be happening is that your snowberry and the dwarf bilberry are more competitive in this wetter western end. The Columbia manzanita more competitive in this drier eastern end. So even within, and of course then the Oregon grape just kind of falls in between. So even in this, what we might have thought of as a uniform anthropogenic ecosystem here, there's still environmental change and changes in the species from one end of it to the other. Okay, so a couple of three interesting tree species. The shore pine or lodgepole pine. Okay, so we find it in both areas. Now, this is a tree that doesn't grow very tall compared to our other conifers and is rapidly shaded out by Douglas fir and other conifers. So it naturally tends to have an affinity to places that had a historic um, uh, regime of anthropogenic burning, because that would keep the tall conifers from overshading it. Um, the quaking aspen was another real interesting thing that came out of this study. We actually find a lot of it up on this North Fork Plateau, but it's scattered around in a few other places as well. It's always associated with a wetland, and I think probably for the same reason it's short. It can be overtopped by conifers, except the conifers can't grow ever on this side of it. It can't grow on the wetland side. They can crowd in the other side, but not on this side. However, the really interesting thing that came out of this study is that in every case that we have found it so far out there, these wetlands are embedded in the bare grass woodland. So there is a fire connection between the quaking aspen, and of course we find this elsewhere in the Rockies and places like that, and where it grows. Finally, the golden chinkapin, it's a rare plant in Washington. In fact, this population up here is the northernmost population of this species. And it's almost always in association with the bare grass burned anthropogenic system. So several really interesting connections right here. Now, the GLO surveyor's notes have a wealth of information if you have the patience to go get it, because these are handwritten notes and very difficult to use for that reason. Now, what you see here, you see these little fine black dots plus all these bigger symbols. Each one of these is a point on a section line that a GLO surveyor made a note. Now, I have transcribed all the notes in that area into a database. And since they have their measurements where each note was taken, I've now attached coordinates to that point. So now I can display all of their notes on spatially. So for example, one of the surveyors was using the term bunch grass. Okay, where did he use it? He used it up here in the North Fork Plateau, right where I just showed you a lot of bare grass. Okay. All the surveyors, when they came across prairies, used the term prairie. And here we are down in the Shelton area, Goose Prairie here, Carstairs Prairie here. Even these little things are prairies out here. So they use that one pretty consistently. The term open, like in open forest, was pretty much always in association with the bare grass woodland. The term grazing up here just north of the Shelton Prairies, indicating that the area outside of the prairies was still rather open and good for grazing. One of the surveyors used the term barrens, and that was down here in the Shelton Prairie area. And some of the surveyors used the term burn, usually in association with the bare grass savanna woodland ecosystem. Now, their term for shore pine is Scotch pine, and they used it pretty much like in the same area that I just showed you where we were finding it, around the Shelton Prairies and up and through the various parts of the bare grass system. And they use the term pine generically as well. The surveyors that surveyed the Olympic foothills used it a lot, and I'm going to guess that we're probably talking Western white pine, but of course we don't know. But other surveyors used it also in the bare grass area, and it's most likely shore pine there, but of course we can't be sure of that. So they also were, one of the main things they're doing is they were putting in section corners out there, and they have to take a certain amount of data around each section corner so that they can re-identify it. If they happen to lose that corner, they can come back and put it in without doing the whole survey. And that information is sufficient to calculate tree density around that section corner. So what I did was I took all the section corners in what I'm calling forest. In other words, it's not in the bare grass polygons. It's not in the prairie polygons. They had 236 of those section corners. And the average tree density out there was a little short of 120 trees per hectare, which is definitely forest. Then if I take all the section corners that fell inside of the bare grass polygon here and calculate tree density at 91 here, it's a little bit over 40 trees per hectare. I only had 4 section corners that actually fell inside of one of these prairie polygons, but that was clear down here at 20-ish trees per hectare. So the long and short of that is the bare grass woodlands are about 2 times denser than the prairies, but the forest is more than 2.5 times denser than the bare grass woodlands. So that shows you that this really is not a prairie, but something along the order of a savanna or a woodland, something a little different, but still very, very open. So that's a lot of fire that we're putting on the landscape out there. So that's going to create a lot of tree injury out there, and that is going to affect not just plants but animals as well. So tree injury creates habitat for many species because once you get the bark injured, wood rotting fungi enter through those wounds, and now you get a hollow or a soft-centered tree. Also, occasionally trees are going to be killed and they're going to have a snag. Now remember, we've got over 100,000 acres of this we're dealing with just in the southeastern Olympic Peninsula. And so there's going to be a lot of this. Now, how do you injure a tree without killing it? Excuse me here. So, you can get a fuel accumulation on one side of the tree and not the other side. And of course, that tree is going to live, but it's going to have a scar on the one side. You can have a double tree like you see right here, and you can accumulate fuels in the crotch between those 2 trees, and you can scar both of them at the same time. Now here we have some Oregon white oaks, which had a log lying between them, and the log burned almost like a cigarette slowly right through there and scarred both of those trees. And the tree over here had a wound fairly high up and was dripping pitch. The pitch is flammable. It caught fire. The tree didn't burn up, but it's going to have a long, narrow scar. Of course, a lot of trees, the fire is going to pass right underneath and not do any damage, but this kind of thing can be happening down there at the ground level. So here is one of the big old Douglas firs that was growing out. It's one that survived out on that bare grass woodland. And you can see it has 2 scars. It actually has a lot of scars on it. We have a big basal scar that's not healed over, and it's rotted out inside. So there's a cavity in there. And so this is going to make great habitat, great denning habitat for, you name it, possums, raccoons, skunks. This one's almost big enough for a bear to den in. So even turkey vultures will utilize these kinds of things for denning in. It's also got this long linear scar that's healed over now, but don't let that fool you. It's certainly got rot in there, and probably the rot is going to the very top of the tree now. And birds and other animals are going to exploit these and actually enhance them somewhat. One of the birds that will enhance it is the pileated woodpecker, because this critter can peck through the hard outer layer to access that rotten tissue inside. And once it does that, it's going to hollow that out and it's going to nest in it. But at some point, it's going to leave, and that hole is going to be left there. And other birds are going to be able to utilize that, like these wood ducks right here. So what we find is that there's a lot of birds in this category. So we have our hardwood excavators up here. We have soft snag excavators. These guys will make their own cavities, but they can't do it in hardwood. But then look at the list of birds that are going to utilize these things once they get abandoned by the original excavator. Well, the western bluebird is one of a special concern here. It's been identified as a species of greatest conservation need by the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. And if you go to their website, you'll find that they're going to tell you significant historical declines of western bluebird populations in western Washington are linked to, among other things, habitat loss due to human activity. I would say maybe human inactivity, because the habitat loss is due to the lack of burning. People used to burn, now they don't. Okay. Western bluebirds nest in snag and tree cavities, and wildfire likely maintains preferred open woodland prairies habitat and snag nesting opportunities. Bingo! That's what we're talking about today. So, prairie and woodland loss due to cessation of anthropogenic burning is likely, I say a major, maybe the major reason for the decline. Okay, let's talk about elk now. This is a wonderful book by Bruce Moorhead here. If you're interested in the Roosevelt elk on the Olympic National Park, this is your go-to book. Um, he calls it the forest elk, and I guess it really is. But I'm going to submit to you that's more by default, not because it really necessarily prefers the forest. It happens to live in a place that has a lot of forest. So Roosevelt elk are considered browsers, as opposed to the Rocky Mountain elk, which are said to prefer grazing. But in fact, Roosevelt elk would prefer to graze whenever possible. Okay. Now, they'll eat the browse in the forest, but they would much rather seek out clear cuts, meadows, and riparian areas to feed. Those are all open areas because those are the places with grasses and forbs. And these are more nutritious and especially more digestible than the shrubs, ferns, and trees in the forest. So they're stuck with a landscape that's got a lot of forest, but remember, they used to have a lot of prairie as well. Because they're eating so much of this inferior food, Roosevelt elk, as it turns out, are much less fertile than the Rocky Mountain elk, by quite a difference, actually. And I'm going to say that perhaps this was different when prairies were available for them to graze on, or at least for some of the herds. Okay, so let's just kind of, where have we been today? Summarize a bit. We talked about oak camas prairies, which are primarily on the east side of the peninsula, bracken camas, which are primarily on the west side of the peninsula. We talked about open beargrass woodlands, and they're on the southeastern part of the Olympic Peninsula, but also there's some out on the Quinault Reservation. All of these areas were maintained by Indian burning. They were diverse with sun-loving species, which are now either gone or in decline. And this landscape functioned differently, much differently for wildlife. Everything from big game to birds to insects, and we haven't even talked about the insects today. So thank you. And I'd entertain questions if you have some.
I've got 3 post-it notes worth of questions. So this is just phenomenal, the background you're giving in here, and it's for sure. And I want to open up the opportunity for everyone to share here. First of all, by the way, the tenaciousness of your research, right? You know, going after those notes of the surveyors from the GLO. I mean, that just that alone indicates a tremendous passion. How did you develop this passion for it, for this pursuit?
This study, my friend Stan Graham and I, we actually started this as a hobby back in the 1990s, and we kind of picked away at it. And at some point, my supervisor at the Pacific Northwest Research Station said, Dave, this is something that you should do as one of your projects. You should bring it in as part of your portfolio because this is important, and we can really help you. So then it became a PNW project. And it wasn't my top priority project, but at least I could get some funding to pay for the trips out to the field to do the sampling and things like that. so it moved along a lot faster then. I'm retired now, but I'm in a volunteer capacity still. I still have my office at the lab, and still plugging away on this and a couple other projects. So yeah, it's been kind of a passion of ours. We both have an interest in history, and we both have an interest in ecology. So it's been very fulfilling down through the years.
Now, relative to the maps that you've shared, right? You've certainly shared where where you're studying things intently today. Have you even envisioned or projected how vast the area might have been burned by the indigenous peoples, at some point? I mean, how much larger was the geography?
Well, we we definitely are able to speculate a bit on that. What we're finding and what I've seen is that even amongst like the South Puget Sound prairies, the forests around them were vastly different. So again, you had the area that the General Land Office surveyors, their definition of prairie was pretty limited. It had to be wide open or they weren't going to map it as a prairie. They had two choices. They could map prairie or they could map timber. They didn't have any other choice. And so if they even had a scattering of Douglas fir trees, they put it into, because those are valuable, they put it into the bin of timber. And of course, we're tempted to say, oh, timber, that must be forest. No, it doesn't mean the same thing. It's simply a category that they used, and it was timber. So a lot of what they put into timber, and I did a study at Joint Base Lewis McChord and was able to show that for hundreds of meters outside of the prairie, you did in fact still have kind of a savanna woodland type environment. So even there, the footprint of the savannas and woodlands is much bigger than the prairies. And probably much of the forest in between the prairies was modified in this way. So the overall footprint is far bigger than what the impression you get from looking at the General Land Office maps. Remember, this is just a call that some person made out in the field. I'm going to put this in prairie or I'm going to put this in timber. They universally put oaks in prairies, by the way. They didn't figure they were commercially valuable, but they universally put Doug fir, even if it's just a scattering, into the timber category. So yeah, there is a lot more out there. I can't say exactly how much, especially when we get to the west side of the Olympic Peninsula. The forest growth has been so rapid and so intense on and around these prairies that it's very, very difficult now to kind of put that back together again. And because it was colonized much later than the Puget Sound lowlands, and in fact, like in Carlisle prairies, had probably grown up into forest even before the first settlers could even get there, because that's how fast trees grow out there. It's going to be very difficult to say, but I think it is safe to say that the footprint of modified land was much greater than anything that people have imagined in the past.
Harry, you have your hand up.
Well, my question is pasture land. If you allow it to grow with tall grass and cut maybe once a year, it's not technically a prairie as you describe the prairies, but is it an adequate substitute?
Well, actually, since we're talking anthropogenic prairies, well, let's be clear about this. Our anthropogenic prairies today include pastures, include parks, golf courses, people's yards. I mean, these are all anthropogenic prairies, okay? So yes, it's a prairie. It will fulfill some of the functions, but of course, in that situation, it's going to become largely dominated by non-native species. Even in burning situations nowadays, we have some pretty tenacious non-native grasses and forbs that are going to be there. So we've definitely changed things forever. But in my opinion, that's better than nothing. You know, certainly there's going to be certainly an animal like elk is going to use that.
They do, yes. Yes, they
Yeah,
do.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No, I mean, I don't think we should throw our hands up in despair just because we don't have the money to fully restore it back to the
The the,
original,
the
you know.
challenge that I find in our pastures is the low growing blackberry
Yeah.
that wants to kind of take over the pastures. Where does that contribute anything?
Well, if we're talking about, well, it certainly would contribute to browse. Deer and elk love that stuff.
Okay.
But yeah, as we get into wetter and wetter environments, the blackberries become more and more aggressive. So the prairies that we have in the South Puget Sound, typically, um, they don't have a lot of blackberry in them, especially not the trailing native blackberry. And you get that back at the edge where you start getting a little bit of shade. What they like is that mix. And so they're more of an edge species. It'll grow in the forest, but it won't flower and fruit there. And then in the South Puget Sound prairies, it won't grow out in the prairie because it's too hot and dry, but along that edge it grows, and the Indians figured that out, and that's where they would get a lot of berries. But now as you get to the west side of the peninsula, things change, and it becomes much more aggressive. And so yes, it will start growing out there, but I wouldn't say that's a deal breaker or a real problem at all.
Corinne, you have your hand up. And Helen, I see that you have your hand up.
Okay, in the meantime, are you aware of the prairie right behind Schaefer State Park? It might be called Horse Prairie. It's up on Bierbauer Road.
Yes, yes, and actually it was on that map that I showed a little while ago. And
I thought it might be, yeah.
yeah, and in fact, I was out there just this last summer putting in more plots on it. It's a
Um,
remarkable little prairie, and I've been following that prairie now for a couple of decades, and it definitely needs some help there. There are parts of it when the first time I saw it had no broom in them at all, but now it's growing a lot of Scotch broom in those areas. So yes, I'm definitely aware of that.
How do you think
it's you knew about the tour that they offered out there through Friends of Schaefer and Lake Sylvia, and it was extremely popular, well received. Maybe we can recruit some of those people to help pull some of the broom.
Yeah, yeah, no, yeah, I was out there on that at that event this last
Yeah,
year. Yeah, it was
yeah.
it's yes, it was a good event. I hope to see more of those in the future.
now the Bear Gulch fire, right? It's up at higher elevations, but is it going to impact? What are your thoughts with respect to any transformation that it will result in?
Well, in terms of bear grass, it's only going to improve the habitat, but and there is bear grass in a lot of that country. Interestingly, that southeastern side of the Olympic Peninsula is the one place where a lot of anthropogenic burning comes right up against the mountains. And it appears that at least from time to time, those fires would burn right on up the slopes. And I think that's why there's so much bear grass. This is one of the few places where subalpine bear grass is connected continuously with bear grass down to the lowlands. And I think it's for that very reason that there's been fire burning from the lowlands right up those slopes. Um, you know, by all accounts, native peoples uh, had a lot of control of their fire. But we're talking 5 to 9,000 years of burning. There were fires that got away, you know, and they burned up those slopes, and they created a different kind of habitat. And now we haven't had until Bear Gulch and a few other smaller fires. a whole lot of fire going up those slopes. So now it's getting way back in the North Fork of the Skokomish now. So it's actually getting out of some of that area where it would typically have burned up the slopes. But yes, all that front along the lowlands over there was occasionally burned, I'm convinced, by escaped woodland fires.
I'm curious about clear cutting, in the forest today. Obviously in commercial timberland, managed by Weyerhaeuser or others, right? The replanting proceeds in a very disciplined manner within just a few years, right?
Right.
But I've noticed in some tribal lands, right, that are not their replanting is more haphazard or if it occurs at all. And so it's a very different regeneration, right, of vegetation that occurs. Uh, I'm curious, any perspectives in terms of is this as close as we're going to come to the historic burning of lands to regenerate prairie lands?
Well, it's a pretty poor substitute for burning. Of course, we used to slash burn those units. We don't do that anymore, and that was maybe a little bit better. But yeah, no, I think it kind of depends on where you are. There actually are units, if you're not looking for regenerating Douglas fir, and of course in a lot of the west side of the Olympic Peninsula, um, you can get an abundant growth of hemlock without much effort at all. And so if you're not looking to replace it with Douglas fir, you probably don't need to do any planting. It's going to come back with a vengeance with Western hemlock, if that's okay with you. So yeah, I don't know specifically the instances that you're talking about, but that would be one thought. But it creates a relatively short window for a species like beargrass. And of course, that window is way too short for any other prairie species to maintain itself. A plant like camas completely goes away the first time it's overtopped, and there is no residual. It doesn't stay in the seed bank or anything like that. But beargrass is able to tolerate shade for a long time. I think at least 60 years, by my estimate, possibly 100 years. It is going to go away eventually, but in a clear cutting situation where we're rotating between 40 and 60 years, maybe 80 years even, um, there's going to be a few plants that are going to make it through that. And then in the sun, they will respond rapidly. They'll beef themselves up and they'll start making flowers and they'll start making babies, and so they'll get a chance to get going again. Um, Assuming they're not using herbicides, because it's susceptible to the herbicides. And I've seen this happen a number of times now where beargrass made it through only to be slammed down by herbicides. So how long this kind of management, how long it can stay in a system with this kind of management, I don't know. Only time will tell. But in some instances, it seems to be able to make it from clear cut to clear cut. But like I say, most of the prairie plants can't do that.
Jude, you have your hand up. And you're on mute.
I wonder if you've looked at the plants that are not very common, like beargrass or camas on the prairies. Have you looked at the very rare plants and see whether they are surviving without the burn? If we have no prairies left, I'll rephrase my question. If the prairies go away totally, is there any plant species that will go away totally too?
Well, yes. I mean, if the prairies go away completely, even common plants like camas are going to go away completely. Um, so an entire flora is going to go away completely. And the diversity that we see, which like I mentioned, if you look at the diversity that's out on a prairie like Glacial Heritage or Mima Mounds or something like that, and compare that to the surrounding forest, there's no comparison. The prairie has far more diversity, and we lose pretty much all of that if we lose those prairies. So yeah, there's a lot of diversity. We also lose habitat for things like Mazama pocket gophers. A number of butterflies are dependent on those prairies. So there's a lot of species that are going to go away if we give up and don't care about them.
Aaron, you have your hand up.
I don't have a question so much as a thank you, because I live on the Camas Oak Prairie and just at the confluence of the Black River and the Chehalis. And so this has given me a lot deeper understanding of the ecosystem that I'm working with. And my biggest battle is the Scotch broom. But when we bought the property, it was 5 acres of solid Scotch broom, 8 feet tall. So we've managed to beat most of it down, but it's still a struggle. But I am seeing more and more of those prairie plants. They are surviving, even though we have very little topsoil and no water holding capacity. They seem to be not quite thriving, but at least improving.
Yeah, restoration is possible. Glacial heritage, which is one of the finest restored prairies that we have. The first time I ever saw that, back early 1980s, probably around 1980, I remember being taken in there by someone who knew their way in, and you had to know your way in because you were pushing through 6, 7 foot tall Scotch broom that was literally hard to push through. And to go back there now and to see what they've been able to do with that is really heartening. They've really worked a miracle on that site. So yes, you can bring it back. Take a lot of work, but yes, you can bring them back.
Now, Chris is asking the question in the chat that I think is top of mind for all of us here. Are they still burning these prairies to maintain them? For example, Mima Mounds in particular.
Yes, Mima Mounds is burned every few years. Glacial Heritage is, Rocky Prairie is, Scatter Creek is, and the prairies out at JBLM are all being burned on a regular basis.
Other questions, other comments? Clearly, the depth of your science and the thoroughness of the research is just fascinating here. So when will your publication be coming out?
I'm thinking we're still a couple years out. Um, so yeah, like I said, this isn't the only project that I'm still working on. I've got a couple others as well. And so I split my time between them. But we still actually have a lot more historical research to do. We're hoping to uncover some good photographs at some point. So we're gradually making the rounds of the historical museums. We've got a lot of work to do up at UW in their archives and in the state archives. So there's a lot of work to do yet to kind of pull this together to be the kind of thing that we want it to be. We're pretty much done going out doing field work. We've got our plots, and we're getting old, and we've kind of decided that we should probably be done with that. So, but yeah, I think we're still a couple years away.
Are there lessons or comments that you'd want to share with us as master gardeners who deal a lot with the public? And much of our public, by the way, is new to our area, right? So they're coming in from other areas. And I'm curious about, are there just general perspectives about what the land looks like and looked like that might be helpful for us to share?
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the biggest misconceptions that I deal with all the time, and it's getting better. I mean, amongst groups like Native Plant Society and groups like that, you find a general appreciation that the landscape wasn't all rainforest here. But I mean, a lot of outsiders come in, and even a lot of people who have lived here for a long time are just assuming that everything was always forested, and not just forested, it was rainforest. Um, Not true. Not true. The native peoples simply couldn't have lived here under those circumstances. A few got pretty heavy into the seafood part of things, the macaws in particular, but for the most part, the land would have been uninhabitable if the natives weren't maintaining these places. So yes, the idea that this area was once very much more diverse than it is now, and that it was people that did it. So the line between what's natural and what's not natural gets blurred a lot here. Okay, so the prairies are not natural. They are anthropogenic. They are something that people made. And yet, all the plants that originally grew on them were native natural species. So we have to get past the idea that we shouldn't touch the landscape, but we have to touch it the right way. And I guess that's the message I would like people to understand.
Final questions or comments for David here?
This is related. You were talking about succession, and perhaps that was limited to prairies. I mean, what normally would happen to restore a prairie, but there were incredible old growth that did not get replaced by hemlock. They were fir, and they were a heck of a lot older than 70 years. So, I mean, I'm still going to be an advocate for those very old trees. And I would like kids to be able to see them. And if we cut them all down, that's not going to be the case.
Well, I certainly don't advocate cutting those big old trees down. And yeah, so the successional pathway that I showed, since I was talking about prairies, I didn't dwell on it, but I did mention that the Douglas fir is only replaced by hemlock over 500 to 1,000 years. So more often than not, what's going to happen is a fire is going to come through there and change the system before that ever happens. But particularly out on the west side of the Olympic Peninsula, you easily achieve those ages, and they are magnificent trees. But keep in mind too that in these woodlands and savannas, very old Douglas fir trees grew on those also. That one that I showed you with the scars on it was probably over 500 years old. I can't get an increment core into it because it's hollow, right? But in coring other trees, I would say that one is easily 500 years old. So no, I'm not advocating getting rid of any of the big old trees. But remember, some of them might have been out on prairies at one time, and now they're surrounded by forest. Also, there are forests of big old trees, and those were never prairies. And I'm not advocating putting a prairie there. So that's why I'm making a map here, is to show where things were on the landscape. So we can know you're not going to find any of those big old trees growing on Carlisle prairies, even though it's all forest, or on Quileute Prairie, even though forest is encroaching. That's not where you're going to find them. So yeah, I'm not advocating getting rid of the old growth trees.
David, thank you so very much for today. I mean, again, this is so comprehensive. This is so very thorough. You've given us we really appreciate the depth and the breadth of coverage that you've given to this subject.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Any other comments for the good of the order? Reminder that there is not a board meeting at 1 o'clock today. There is no board meeting today. Our next get together, of course, are these various plant clinics and meetings that we talked about on the calendar earlier. And we'll certainly see you all coming up at the picnic on the 20th. David, thank you so very much. It's just really been a thrill to have you here with us today.
Well, you're welcome, and thanks for letting me talk to your group.
Okay. Goodbye, all.
Hey, Kelly, one
Yes,
last little
Gwendolyn.
thing. So I've now taken over the admin duties of the of our Facebook page for our group, And so please send me material to post, pictures, images, logos. Yeah, I mean, whatever, needs to go on there. Please send them to me. And you can send them, and if you want to make a post, then you can post, and I'll like approve it, or not, or whatever. But yeah, so send the information to me.
Thank you, Gwendolyn. Let's make sure we get an update for that in the next e-news, right? So that everyone is formally aware. And thank you for stepping up, by the way. Thank you.
No, you're welcome.
Okay, everyone, stay safe.